Now, as luck would have it, back during the time I was studying Stan Grof's stuff, I was also studying Ken Wilber. And it's with Wilber that I learned about another type of spectrum, what he called the spectrum of consciousness. And as it turns out, just as people in psychosis have experiences ranging from the very fearful to the very loving, according to Wilber, we actually evolve from more closed, fearful levels of consciousness to more open, loving levels of consciousness. And so, in recognizing this parallel between the spectrum of psychosis and the spectrum of consciousness, I started to wonder if they would somehow match up. Meaning, would people at a higher, more loving level of consciousness have more spiritual emergency type of psychosis? Would the people at the lower levels have more fearful, schizophrenic type psychosis? And most importantly, would the people in the middle have more mixed episodes, the typical type of bipolar psychosis? Now, in order to see if this theory had any useful value to it, the toughest part for me was going to be determining if schizophrenia was connected to the lowest levels of consciousness. And this was mainly because I didn't have a lot of contact with people who had severe schizophrenia, the type of people who might spend many months or years in psychiatric institutions. However, after a few years of research and a lot of reading, I did find that there are a number of similarities between the way people at lower levels of consciousness think and the way people with schizophrenia think. Now, along with the very fearful life experience that I've already talked about, probably the most obvious and important similarity is that both groups have hallucinations. In fact, there's a very interesting book by a guy named Julian Jaynes called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And in this book, he explains how people, not only at the tribal level of consciousness, but also at the earliest levels of civilization, people in the feudal level, were not directed by their own mind, but by the commanding visions and voices of the gods. In fact, visions and voices were common in ancient Egypt, Greece, India, and among tribal peoples around the world. Proof of the commonplace nature of these occurrences can be found in the earliest books of the Old Testament, parts of the Greek Iliad, and the Hindu Vedas as well. In fact, hallucinations were so pervasive in these more primitive civilizations that Jaynes writes, according to our theory, we could say that before the second millennium BC, everyone was schizophrenic. And just like with primitive peoples, when someone with schizophrenia has a hallucination, they interpret that vision or voice concretely, never symbolically. So that angel that they see or hear appears to them as real as the hand in front of your face. And because of this concrete way of interpreting reality, when people at these levels have a God experience, it's very common for them to think that they are the exact reincarnation of Jesus Christ, having power over others. Now, I know this may seem highly irrational, but you need to understand that in both groups, reality is seen as an entirely magical place. Because, as I explained in my videos on tribal consciousness, the inner world and the outer world are fused together, making both schizophrenics and tribal people highly superstitious. And so with a mind that works like this, it's no wonder that both groups have a deep fear and respect for evil spirits, devils, and demons. It truly is a mind where any fears that you have are brought to life. So overall, whether someone is at a lower level of consciousness or they're suffering from schizophrenia, we're really seeing someone who's living in their own world, someone who sees the world from one perspective. The movie The Soloist, starring Jamie Foxx and Robert Downey Jr., gives a very honest look at how isolated this one-perspective reality can be. There, Foxx plays a former musician who now lives in a world of shadows and potential threats due to his schizophrenia. And as you'll see, the one-perspective reality makes it very difficult for him to maintain any relationships because it's almost impossible for him to consider other people's thoughts and feelings when he makes decisions or takes action. So, considering all of these similarities, I think it's safe to say that we've got a clear connection between the type of psychosis associated with schizophrenia and the lower levels of consciousness. Now, the question was, would I find a similar relationship at the higher end of the spectrum? Well, to start, the Power of Now level and the Postmodern level are the most open, loving levels of consciousness in the model. These levels also have a much more spiritual but non-religious view of life, which parallels the insistence of many people in spiritual emergencies that they're in fact going through a spiritual experience. These are also the most intuitive levels of consciousness, where people often override their purely rational, logical thinking and trust their intuitive feeling for things instead. And this ties in with the intuitive interpretation that people give when they're having a spiritual emergency, that they're going through something very important, some inexplicable inner process which must be completed. Both groups also see reality as being deeply meaningful on a symbolic level. They will think, wow, this looks like a hotel, but it feels like purgatory. Or he looks like a security guard, but he seems like an angel. As a result, rather than being bombarded with the disturbing concrete thoughts and hallucinations of schizophrenia, people in a spiritual emergency are often quite pleasantly surprised by startling synchronicities, especially receiving messages from the television, music, or other symbolic communications which seem specifically designed for them. But of course, as people at the higher levels of consciousness know, synchronicities aren't just for people that are in experiences of psychosis. Many postmodern spiritual books like the Celestine Prophecy discuss the importance of synchronicities in our daily lives. Global issues such as poverty, the environment, war, or racism could all surface when somebody is in the middle of a spiritual emergency, and these are issues that increase in personal importance as you get into the higher levels of consciousness. And finally, as opposed to the one perspective thinking of schizophrenia, many people in spiritual emergencies are already thinking in a postmodern multiple perspective way of seeing things. To give one example, my favorite stories of so-called psychosis come from former atheists who open up to seeing life from different perspectives once they're hit with a powerful spiritual emergency. So once again, it appears that we have a lot of compelling evidence for connecting the more positive spiritual experiences of a spiritual emergency with the higher levels of consciousness. Okay, so what would connect the middle, traditional, and modern levels of consciousness to the type of psychosis usually diagnosed as bipolar mania? Well, based on my research, I would say that the main characteristic at this level is confusion. Being bipolar is confusing for a couple of reasons. First, like I said, you're most likely having a mixed episode. You're having experiences of love expressed through cosmic oneness, timelessness, and a sense of all-knowingness, just to give a few examples. But on the other hand, it can be very frightening as well, as many people experience moments of paranoia, even hallucinations, and regressions into trauma, which can be quite painful. And then, of course, there's the drugs, which don't help much either. For most people with bipolar disorder, drug experiences, usually with marijuana or LSD, have been a part of what triggered their first episode. So for yourself and others, it may be hard to separate the effects of the drug from the psychosis itself. Another source of confusion is simply the way people think at these levels of consciousness. You see, as we evolve from the magical, concrete lower levels to the symbolic, intuitive higher levels, the middle levels, particularly the modern level, is much more factual and logical. And as a result, any inner experiences we happen to be going through are invalidated, they're denied because they can't be measured. If you're at the modern level, everyone will have you believing that your disorder is caused by a chemical imbalance, even though the scientific evidence will show that you're biologically normal. At the traditional level, people might see you as having a moral flaw, like God is punishing you for something you did. But either way, regardless of how you felt about your experience on the other side, people at these two middle levels of consciousness will work to convince you that these experiences are bad and better off forgotten. And if you're at those middle levels, you'll probably believe them. So once again, we find a lot of compelling evidence demonstrating that a typical bipolar psychosis usually fits within the modern and traditional levels of consciousness, especially because at this stage of development, any spiritual experiences we go through are denied, first by our society, then by ourselves. Schizophrenia, bipolar mania, spiritual emergencies. The spectrum of psychosis matches seamlessly with the spectrum of consciousness. Now, just recognizing this relationship will be a huge step forward for both psychiatry and psychology. But before I explain why, I need to add one more very important factor to our model. A factor that will also help us understand why it's much easier for some people to heal from psychosis than others. And that missing factor is trauma.